Some battles don't start with gunfire, they begin with silence. Arnold Schwarzenegger hadn't worn a badge in years. But one quiet evening in East Los Angeles, a slap echoed down a city block and into his past. The man who delivered it had no idea who he'd touched, but Arnold did. And what followed wasn't revenge, it was reckoning. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe. The heat hung low over East Los Angeles that afternoon, the kind that clung to your skin and made the air feel heavier than it should. On the corner of Esteban and Ninth, a small grocery store buzzed quietly, frequented mostly by working-class immigrants, mothers with strollers, and older men in faded Dodgers caps. No one noticed the tall man stepping out with a brown paper bag in his arms, at least. Not at first. He wore a dark gray jacket over a plain black shirt, jeans, and boots. The kind of outfit meant to disappear in a crowd, but his presence didn't quite vanish. It was in the way he moved slow, steady, like someone used to waiting, watching, surviving. Arnold Schwarzenegger didn't look like a former governor or a legend that helped shape 2 decades of American popular culture. He looked like a man buying groceries. And that was the problem. Across the street, a black and white patrol car idled with its engine humming low. Inside, 2 officers watched. One of them, Officer Jimenez, leaned forward, unsure. The other, Sergeant Brett Thompson, white, square-jawed, mid-40s, sat still, chewing his gum like it owed him money. "He looks familiar," Jimenez muttered. "Nah," Thompson replied. "Just another guy who thinks he doesn't need to be checked." The door opened with force. Thompson didn't wait for backup or reason. He just stepped out and crossed the street, eyes locked on Arnold, like he'd already decided how this would end. Arnold walked calmly toward the corner, adjusting the grip on his bag eggs. Apples, a bottle of water, a pack of protein bars. Nothing dangerous, nothing illegal, just a grocery run. He didn't flinch when he heard the boots behind him. "Hey," Thompson barked. "Where you think you're going?" Arnold turned, expression still and unreadable. "I'm going home. Where'd you get that bag?" Arnold's eyes narrowed. From inside, "I paid. Got a receipt?" "Yes." But Thompson wasn't looking for proof. He was looking for confrontation. "You look tense," he said, stepping closer. "Got something to hide?" Arnold didn't answer. He didn't need to. The tension was already rising. A teenager nearby had lifted his phone, live streaming instinctively like kids do now. He whispered to his friends, "Yo, something's about to go down." And then it happened. Without warning, without provocation, Thompson slapped Arnold across the face. Loud, sharp. The bag crumpled slightly in Arnold's grip, but he didn't move, didn't raise a hand, didn't blink. The street went silent. The teen gasped. Someone else cursed. "You think you're untouchable," Thompson spat. "People like you think you can just walk free." Arnold looked at him then, and something in his gaze shifted. Not fear, not rage. Something colder, older. "You don't know who I am." "Do you?" he said quietly. Thompson scoffed. "Don't care." But the kid with the phone, his eyes widened. "Wait, is that?" The live stream kept rolling. And the internet, as always, was already watching. It didn't take long. By the time the sun dipped below the rooftops of East LA, the video had already crossed 1 million views. A teenager's shaky live stream, captioned, "Cop slaps old man for no reason," exploded across every platform within hours. But it wasn't just the slap that caught the internet's attention. It was the face, blurry at first, then sharpened through AI filters, photo matches, and amateur sleuths on Twitter. The man holding the crumpled grocery bag wasn't just some stranger. He was Arnold Schwarzenegger, former governor of California, movie star, veteran, a man who had once stood beside presidents, passed sweeping criminal justice reforms, and served as a goodwill ambassador across conflict zones. The headlines came like fire. Sergeant assaults Arnold Schwarzenegger outside LA Market. Hero to millions humiliated in broad daylight. Governor attacked LAPD silent. Inside the local precinct, the mood had shifted. Sergeant Thompson, still fuming, was locked in an interview room with Internal Affairs. Officer Jimenez sat silent in his cruiser, replaying the moment over and over in his mind. The precinct captain, a woman who had campaigned for police accountability, was on the phone with City Hall, whispering the one phrase no department wants to hear. We didn't know it was him, but Arnold. He didn't press charges. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't go on television or shout into microphones. Instead, he stood on the steps of a community center the next morning, surrounded by reporters and camera crews. No suit, no security, just jeans, boots, and a quiet presence that drew everyone in. When the microphones went up, he didn't blink. What happened yesterday wasn't about me, he said, voice calm. That slap didn't land on a movie star or a politician. It landed on everyone who gets stopped for how they look, for their accent, their clothes, their skin. I've seen what happens when we let power go unchecked. I've seen it in other countries. I've seen it here, and I won't be quiet about it. The crowd didn't cheer. They listened. Because when someone like Arnold speaks not as a celebrity, but as a witness, it cuts deeper. News anchors pulled up old footage. Arnold speaking to the UN. Arnold visiting military bases. Arnold training young cadets in post-war Iraq. Clips of him signing the 2005 Community Stability Initiative, a state-led funding program to strengthen tactical readiness in high-risk zones. A program many credited with reducing street violence. A program some said had gone too far. A program that, decades later, would quietly evolve into something else entirely. And back at the precinct, someone finally asked the question that should have come sooner. Who gave Thompson that authority? The background check came in clean. Decorated officer, commendations, no formal complaints, but buried inside the metadata of his internal profile was a simple three-letter tag, C9X. At first glance, meaningless. But for those who remembered, it stood for something older, something buried. Code 9, a unit with no official record, no oversight, and no reason to still exist. Thompson didn't know who he'd slapped, but the truth was harsher than he could have imagined. He hadn't just hit a former governor. He had assaulted the very man who unknowingly signed the order that created him. And now, that man was awake, watching, and ready to pull back the curtain on everything he once believed was necessary. The question wasn't what would happen next. It was how far the system would go to stop him from finding out. The lights inside LAPD's Internal Affairs building flickered under the hum of old fluorescent bulbs. Most of the desks were empty, chairs pushed back, phones silent. It was well past 8 when Arnold pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped inside. At the far end of the room, behind stacks of folders and a humming monitor, sat Helen Ruiz. Her eyes lifted, weary but sharp. She didn't smile, didn't stand, just looked at him like someone staring down the ghost of a decision made years ago. "You still walk like a soldier," she said. Arnold nodded. "You still read people like a knife." She gestured for him to sit. Helen had served under his administration years earlier, Deputy Director for Criminal Integrity Initiatives, one of the few who never cared about political favors or applause. She had left government shortly after he did, disappearing into oversight work while he disappeared into the private quiet of post-governorship life. Now she pulled up a screen and turned it toward him. "Thompson's internal profile just came back," she said, and Arnold asked. She tapped the corner of the screen. There it was again, that same designation. C9X. "Code 9, Arnold asked, his voice low, the words slow. Helen nodded. "That's what it was originally, but they don't use that name anymore. Now it's called Sentinel Ops, just a different skin, same skeleton." Arnold leaned back in the chair, the silence between them heavier than any file. Sentinel Ops. It wasn't supposed to exist. Code 9 had been created under his watch as part of a broader initiative to stabilize gang-heavy neighborhoods, a joint force between tactical units and federal oversight. On paper, It was clean, focused, strategic, but he hadn't read every page, hadn't seen the attachments buried in annex reports or the loopholes in language. He had trusted others to monitor it, and now the trust had come due. They went dark 10 years ago, Helen said. No budget reports, no public assignments, but I started seeing the tags show up again this past year. Quiet, internal only on certain profiles. Arnold stared at the screen, then down at the desk, then at his own hands. So they buried it? He said. Not entirely, Helen replied. She opened a drawer and slid over a faded folder with a printed memo from 2006. At the bottom of the page, above the final line of approval, was a signature. His. You gave them the authority, she said, not knowing what they'd become. Arnold didn't argue. He didn't deflect. He picked up the paper, stared at the ink that had long since dried, and said nothing. The silence spoke loud enough. This isn't your fault, Helen said gently. No, Arnold replied. It's worse. I thought I was protecting people. I thought I was building something that would bring control where chaos had taken hold. But I wasn't watching close enough. I let them shape the tools without checking what they planned to do with them. Helen sat back. And now they're using those tools on civilians, on people like you, on people who don't have cameras, or lawyers, or a name. Arnold folded the file closed. Then we take it back. Whatever they turned it into, we expose it. Every layer, every name. Helen hesitated. That's not going to be easy. You're not governor anymore. Arnold looked at her, eyes steady. Exactly, which means I don't have to play politics. I just have to play fair. As he stood, Helen reached under her desk and pulled out a drive. You'll want this, she said. It's a personnel roster. Every Sentinel Ops officer flagged in the last 3 years. Arnold took it, slid it into his coat, and nodded once, then paused at the door. You were right about me walking like a soldier, he said, but I think it's time I walk like a citizen again. Behind him, the screen faded to black, and the truth was just beginning to flicker back to life. The apartment building stood quiet in South Central Los Angeles, paint peeling, windows cracked, a silence too heavy for the afternoon sun. Arnold climbed the narrow staircase slowly, every creak of the wood sounding louder than it should. At the end of the hall, apartment 3B, he knocked once, then again. The door opened halfway, a chain still latched. Behind it, a man stared out with tired eyes and a face weathered beyond its years. Took you long enough, he said. You're harder to find than you used to be, Arnold replied. The chain slid back. Darryl Baines opened the door fully and stepped aside. The apartment was stripped down. No TV, no photos, just a mattress, a folding chair, and a coffee pot that hadn't been cleaned in days. The blinds were half shut, the light filtered like memory through dust. Darryl didn't offer coffee. He just sat on the edge of the mattress and looked up. You here for the truth or the guilt? Arnold didn't answer right away. He walked to the window, looked out at the cracked street below, then turned. Maybe both, he said. Darryl had once been a rising star in post-war operations, a military police officer deployed during the Iraq Reconstruction Initiative. He served alongside Arnold during the early civilian missions. Smart, precise, loyal to a fault. When Arnold returned to the States and became governor, he pulled Darryl into the early advisory group on community stabilization. It was Darryl who warned him, back then, warned that too much power with too little oversight would become a monster. I filed the report in 2013, Darryl said. Voice low. I had footage, logs, witnesses. I submitted it to the Office of Tactical Oversight. 2 weeks later, I was reassigned. 3 weeks after that, they flagged my benefits for review. My son got dropped from my insurance. My ex-wife didn't want a target in the house, so I left. Arnold clenched his jaw, the weight of old decisions pressing on his spine. I didn't know, he said. No, Darryl replied. But someone did. and they made sure you didn't find out. The silence stretched. Outside, a siren wailed far away and faded again. You signed the order that gave them cover, Darryl said. You handed them a shield and never looked to see what they were hiding behind it. Arnold sat, elbows on his knees, the guilt sinking deeper than the old floorboards. I thought it was about protecting neighborhoods, bringing structure, stability. Darryl shook his head. You gave them doctrine. You gave them tactics. You gave them legal invisibility. What they did with it was exactly what it was built for. Arnold didn't argue. He couldn't. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out the flash drive Helen had given him. I have names, he said. Assignments. Movement patterns. Someone's still directing this thing from the inside. Darryl took the drive, stared at it, then stood and walked to a small file box near the mattress. He pulled out a thin folder, dog-eared, yellowed, but intact. Inside, a name circled in red ink, a signature, a date. You want to know who signed off on suppressing my complaint? He asked. Arnold nodded slowly. Darryl held up the folder. Shaw, Senator Albert Shaw, your former national security advisor. The name hit like concrete. Arnold remembered him well. Polished, brilliant, always 5 moves ahead. Shaw had championed the stability doctrine, had been the architect of many of the state's emergency powers provisions. Back then, Arnold thought he was just another bureaucrat trying to manage chaos. Now, it was clear Shaw hadn't managed it. He had engineered it. I don't want revenge, Darryl said. I want accountability. Arnold stood, face grim. Then we get it. Piece by piece. No more shadows. As he stepped toward the door, Darryl called out, You still believe in redemption? Arnold looked back. Only if it comes with justice. The door closed behind him, and the ghosts he thought he'd buried walked with him down the stairs. The ballroom was dressed in formality. Polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, rows of suited officials murmuring over hors d'oeuvres and folded agendas. The banner overhead read Urban Security Roundtable, Strategic Stability in American Cities. But behind the smiles and talking points, everyone in the room knew why they were really there. Damage control, the slap, the video, the whispers of Sentinel Ops. It had all lit a fire under the Capitol, and this event wasn't about policy anymore. It was about containment, and into that curated calm walked Arnold Schwarzenegger. Not as a guest, but as a storm. He didn't wear a tie. He didn't check in. He walked straight through the lobby of the Grand Reading Hotel, past lobbyists, past state deputies, past the governor's liaison herself, and into the room where the real conversations were happening. Phones came out. People stepped aside. Some tried not to look. Others stared. Because despite all the spin and denials, the man who had once signed the very laws being weaponized now stood uninvited, unapologetic, and unwilling to be ignored. Senator Albert Shaw was already on stage, flanked by panelists and nodding along to a pre-scripted statement about community partnerships. When he saw Arnold enter, the words faltered, only for a second. Then Shaw recovered, smiled, and gestured toward the former governor with open arms. Well, if it isn't the man of the hour, he said. The room gave a half-hearted chuckle. Arnold didn't smile. Helen Ruiz was watching from the service balcony above, a discreet tablet on her lap, streaming the feed through a private channel. Hidden beneath the podium where Shaw stood was a wireless microphone activated 5 minutes earlier by a technician who thought he was fixing an audio glitch. The stream was already live. DOJ, independent media, civil rights lawyers. Hundreds were watching. Arnold approached the stage without hesitation. You're good with word, Albert, he said, voice even. You always have been. But you're not here to talk. You're here to bury something. Shaw didn't blink. I'm here to represent the people's interest in a secure and stable society, he replied. That's what this gathering is for. Arnold stepped closer. No. You're here because you built a machine that operates in the dark. You signed suppression orders. You erased whistleblowers. and you turned a security directive into a private army. The room shifted. The air changed. One of Shaw's security detail moved slightly toward the stage. Arnold saw it. So did Helen. Shaw laughed, thin and careful. Let me ask you something. Arnold, do you think the public wants honesty chaos, or do they want order control safety? Sometimes people don't know what's best for them, and sometimes they need to feel strength before they understand where the line is. He said it casually, but the sentence echoed across the live stream. Clipped, replayed, spread in real time. Arnold didn't raise his voice. He just stepped beside the senator and said, "You've forgotten who the strength belongs to. It's not yours, it's theirs." Shaw's smile thinned. One of his bodyguards stepped forward, fast, hand reaching toward Arnold's shoulder. It was a mistake. Before the man could finish his movement, Arnold pivoted, redirected his momentum, and sent him crashing sideways into the corner of the dais. The crowd gasped. The cameras turned. Shaw stood frozen, eyes flicking to the fallen guard, then to Arnold. "You assaulted my protection detail," he said, trying to regain control. Arnold stepped closer, voice low. "Your protection just tried to detain a private citizen in front of 200 witnesses and a live stream watched by thousands more." From the balcony, Helen gave the signal. The feed shifted angles, now showing multiple views of the confrontation. Journalists started checking their phones. Newsrooms lit up. "Call security," Shaw muttered. Arnold shook his head. "Don't bother. I didn't come here to fight you. Albert, I came to expose you." He reached into his jacket, not for a weapon, but for a printed page. He held it up. "This is your approval memo for Sentinel Ops, signed in 2014 as acting chair of the Urban Threat Advisory Board. And this," he held up a second page, "is the suppression order for Darryl Baines's whistleblower report, executed by your office 3 weeks after his dismissal." Shaw's face tightened. "You're reaching, Arnold. You're desperate. These programs were necessary responses to rising threats. You don't know what kind of forces we were dealing with." Arnold took a breath. "No, Albert, you don't get to hide behind fear anymore. You manufactured those threats. You created an internal militia and buried the oversight." And then Shaw said something he wasn't supposed to. "I didn't create anything. I just maintained what was given to me." Arnold paused. "Given to you by who?" Shaw's lips tightened. He said nothing. But Helen was already digging. On her screen, a name lit up a forgotten authorization chain buried beneath layers of committee sign-offs. One man sat above it all, a man who hadn't been seen in public in over a decade. Randolph Krieg. Arnold caught the flicker in Shaw's eyes. The flinch, the hesitation. That was the moment everything changed. Because Shaw wasn't the architect. He was just the voice of something older, something deeper, something still in play. And now, Arnold wasn't just fighting a corrupt program. He was chasing a ghost with blueprints. The Mojave was never meant to be quiet. The wind carried dust like whispers across the bone-dry horizon, and the sun, even in its descent, scorched everything it touched. Out there, buried beneath decades of classified projects and decommissioned airfields, sat a concrete husk that once housed Cold War dreams. Now it served a different purpose. Beneath its rusted hangars and sandblasted radar towers, someone had taken root. Someone who hadn't been seen in over 10 years. Randolph Krieg. Helen Ruiz found the trail first, a data packet buried deep in a federal redundancy server, disguised as an expired defense contract. Baines traced it further, linked it to fuel records from a private refueling drone, irregular power spikes at the site, and a single unregistered transmission logged 6 weeks ago. No names, just coordinates. But it was enough. Enough to move. Arnold volunteered to make contact. No team, no badge, no press. Just a name and a message. He would come alone, under a false alias, posing as a whistleblower with access to the Sentinel Ops exposure files. He didn't need to act. The offer was real enough. Krieg took the bait. They set the meeting for sundown. Arnold arrived an hour early. DOJ techs had already set up surveillance relays in the ridge above the base, drones floating like silent birds overhead. Micro cameras were embedded in the outer walls, audio sensors inside. Tactical response teams stayed back far enough to give Krieg confidence, close enough to strike. Arnold stepped into the hangar. The air was still, stale, humming faintly with hidden electricity. Then a figure emerged from the shadows, thinner than his file photos, but sharp-eyed. He wore a tailored coat the color of smoke, his steps quiet, deliberate. No security detail. Just him. Randolph Krieg. "You're bolder than I expected," Krieg said, voice calm. "I thought they would send lawyers, or maybe a drone strike." Arnold stood tall, unreadable. "I thought you stopped running." Krieg smiled. "I never ran. I just watched." They circled one another like predators pretending to be diplomats. Arnold reached into his coat and pulled out a flash drive. "This is what you wanted. Names, locations, communications logs. You give me what I need. I give you this." Krieg stepped forward, not toward the drive, but toward the man holding it. "You think I'm worried about documents? You think this ends with files? No. Files are for journalists. I build systems." He dropped a metal case at Arnold's feet. "You want truth? Open it." Arnold hesitated, then knelt slowly and flicked the latches. Inside, not papers, not cash, a sleek black tablet, already powered on. On the screen, a grid of live camera feeds, street corners, playgrounds, a school bus, and then, unmistakably, the face of a teenage girl stepping off a curb in Los Angeles, Arnold's goddaughter. "Emma," Krieg spoke softly now, "you don't understand the scale of what you're challenging. Sentinel Ops is a result, not a creation. You didn't invent the problem. I didn't either. I just built a structure to survive it." Arnold's jaw clenched. "You used people. You destroyed lives." Krieg nodded. "And you helped. You just didn't know it." The feeds disappeared. The screen went dark. "Don't worry," Krieg said. "She's safe. For now. But you keep pushing, and the system pushes back. That's what systems do." Arnold didn't answer. His fingers tapped the edge of the case once. That was the signal. A high-pitched tone cracked through the silence. Drones activated. The walls came alive with movement. Tactical agents poured from hidden panels in the hangar. Floodlights snapped on. Krieg didn't move. He just sighed. "Entrapment," he muttered. "No," Arnold said. "Exposure." Krieg stepped back, hands raised. "You think the game ends because you caught a piece of it? I trained them not to need me. This doesn't stop. It evolves." DOJ agents surrounded him, securing the case, the tablet, Krieg himself. As they cuffed him, he looked directly at Arnold. "You've made this personal? That was a mistake." Arnold stood still. "You made it personal the moment you brought a child into it." He turned to Helen, who had just entered the hangar, tablet in hand. She nodded. "We've got it. Live feed, backup copies, every word." Krieg was taken away, but the war wasn't over. Later that night, as Arnold sat alone in the surveillance truck reviewing the footage, his phone buzzed. A blocked number. A voice came through, distorted and quiet. "Krieg was the first firewall. There's another, and he knows you're coming." Then silence. The architect was down, but the foundation was still alive. The DOJ war room was buried 2 levels beneath the main justice building, shielded in concrete, steel, and a silence that hummed like pressure. It was nearly midnight when Arnold stepped inside, followed by Helen and Baines. The room was lit by a dozen monitors, each one streaming intel feeds, encrypted comms, and maps pulsing with red indicators. The team was small analysts, a cyber forensics lead, and one federal prosecutor watching everything unfold like a chessboard that had just flipped. Arnold didn't sit. He stood at the center, arms crossed, watching the monitor labeled threat activity, domestic. We leak it tonight, Helen said, sliding a drive across the table. The fake version, a breadcrumb trail that points to Zurich. It needs to be just real enough to trigger panic. Arnold nodded once. We don't hit them with facts. We hit them with fear. Let's see how their system reacts when they think someone else is pulling the strings. At 12:42 a.m., a fabricated metadata set designed to mimic classified files called Core Protocol was injected into a dormant intelligence Dropbox registered to a ghost shell company in Switzerland. Within 12 minutes, offshore web crawlers picked it up. Within 15, a military-grade intrusion attempt flagged it for alert. And at minute 21, someone inside Krieg's abandoned command structure made a mistake. The ping came from Arizona, not a random node, not a proxy, a secured uplink from a private facility registered to a regional training academy used by law enforcement contractors. And in that ping was a single digital handshake, an automatic beacon tied to the real core file. Helen caught it first. Her voice dropped. They just exposed themselves. Arnold moved behind her, watching the data feed trace the signal back to a small town called Del Oro Junction, just west of Phoenix, a facility listed as a defensive tactics school, leased by a company called Tempest Global. We've heard that name before, Baines muttered. Private contracts, crowd control units, untraceable payroll. They launched a remote probe penetrating the outer firewall just long enough to access one video folder labeled Doctrine Archive. Inside were training modules, real ones. No narration, no disclaimers, just footage. Dozens of recruits lined up in black-gray uniforms. No name tags, no insignias. A voice barked commands off camera. What do we protect? The voice demanded. The room echoed. Territory, another command. What do we eliminate? Interference? And then, clearer than anything else, came the line that cracked the silence in the DOJ war room. We are not here to serve. We are here to maintain position. Police do not protect. Police preserve structure. Arnold's face hardened. Helen clicked to the next file, raw footage of real-world simulations. Uniformed trainees storming mock protest camps. Zip-tying actors playing journalists. Red circles appeared on faces. Voice IDs confirmed matches. One name lit up in yellow. Isaiah Colton, current candidate for mayor of Los Angeles. Former deputy commissioner of public safety. Decorated, charismatic. Publicly running on a platform of justice reform. The room went quiet. No one vetted him this deep. The prosecutor whispered. He's everywhere. Morning shows. Debate stages. He's clean. No, Arnold said. He's just polished. Helen pulled the files, downloaded the visual matches, and locked the stream behind a secure chain. If we release this, she said, we're not just exposing a program. We're igniting a political firestorm. Then let it burn. Arnold answered. No more illusions. No more masks. Outside, the city was sleeping. Inside, the truth was waking up. At exactly 8:00 p.m., the DOJ feed went live. No fanfare, no dramatic countdown, just a black screen that faded into raw footage training halls, command briefings, masked exercises carried out in silence. Then the voice, flat and deliberate. Police do not protect. Police preserve structure. The video ran just over 7 minutes, long enough to show the world that Code 9 was not just a relic of the past, but a living mechanism designed to suppress, control, and erase. It aired on every major platform, mirrored through civil rights networks, student coalitions, veteran groups. No one could ignore it. Not anymore. The press conference after wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Reporters sat frozen, some with phones still shaking in their hands. Darryl Baines stood behind the podium, voice steady. For a decade, I lived under a name that wasn't mine. I watched my son graduate from behind a crowd because I couldn't be seen. I watched men I once trained become shadows. But tonight, I get to say my name again. I am Darryl Baines, and I'm not hiding anymore. Arnold sat in the front row, silent. He didn't take the stage, didn't wave, didn't ask for credit. When the cameras turned toward him, he nodded once and left before the questions could begin. By 9:15, he was back in South Los Angeles, walking past murals and chain-link fences, back to the old community gym he'd helped open 20 years earlier. The building looked the same: faded paint, scuffed doors, the echo of heavy bags swinging in quiet. On the front glass, taped gently with blue painter's tape, was a piece of paper, handwritten, uneven, but clear. You didn't flex your strength. You lifted ours. He read it for a long time, then opened the door. Inside, the light was soft, familiar. A few kids trained in the far corner, laughing between sets. Nobody looked up. Nobody needed to. He belonged there, not as a name, not as a legend. Just a man who showed up when it counted. On the front desk sat a single envelope. No name, no address. Just one line stamped on the flap. Phase 2, Pacific Shield. He didn't open it. Not yet. Some fights are won in the light. Others wait in the dark. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.